The sun fell like a curse upon the sand, a white fire that seared the skin and blurred the air into trembling waves. Yet the heat, suffocating as it was, paled beside the deeper chill, the knowledge of what was about to happen. At the center of the arena, a woman trembled, not because the desert light burned her, nor because the sand scalded her bare feet, but because every roar from the stands confirmed what she already knew. These thousands had not come to see her live. They had come to see her vanish. The sound was more than sound. It was a living force, a monster of 10,000 throats, a single mind with a single verdict. The Praetorian who shoved her forward gave no protection. His touch was not even human anymore, but a gesture of transfer. Her life no longer belonged to herself, nor to the gods she whispered to in silence. It belonged to Rome, to this amphitheater, to the swarm of faces staring down with pitiless anticipation. Here, death was not an accident, nor a somber punishment hidden behind walls. It was theater. The magistrates called it justice, but there was no balance, no mercy. There was only choreography, the drawing of a sword at the exact moment the crowd hushed, the pause before the curtain of violence rose, the release of the beast when the tension reached its peak. Every movement was designed not merely to kill, but to enthrall. The condemned was no longer a woman. She was a symbol, her identity stripped away, her agony rehearsed into the role of an actor in a play no one ever chose. The crowd did not see her face. They saw treason, impiety, theft, the generic shape of wrong in human flesh, and when the crowd applauded her downfall, it was not her they condemned, but everything she was made to represent. It is easy to imagine this roar as something foreign to us, something belonging to a crueler, simpler age. But consider the way modern crowds rise as one when an opponent is crushed in a stadium. Consider the ecstasy when danger flirts with disaster in extreme sports, or when viral videos of pain circle the globe faster than compassion can. No lions leap at us, no blades gleam in sunlight, but the mechanism is the same. The fascination with the thin membrane between life and death, between safety and annihilation. In the arena, the fear of the condemned was inverted into amusement. Her gasps became applause, her fall a lesson. Rome wrapped its power in this theater, reminding each spectator, we own you, not only in how you live, but in how you die. This was not an isolated cruelty. It was the center of social life in the most formidable empire of its age. The amphitheater was temple and circus, courthouse and slaughterhouse. The gods were invoked to sanctify the act, even as the blood of the condemned baptized the sand. Every scream, every collapse, every body dragged into shadow declared the same truth. Rome can do anything. Today, when we remember that first moment, the woman kneeling in the dust, the crowd's breath rising like a storm, we must ask, how many Romes still live within us? The architecture has changed. The screens are brighter. The costumes are different. But the impulse, the addiction to witness destruction, remains. Where once the arena was washed each evening to erase the gore, now we cleanse our screens with the swipe of a hand. What Rome consumed in flesh, we consume in images. And the question that lingers across 2 millennia is not about Rome at all, but about us. Are we watching history, or are we watching a reflection? This is the beginning of the journey, into the heart of an empire that perfected not just the art of killing, but the art of turning death itself into spectacle, into the place where justice fused with theater, where humanity was devoured under applause, into the ritual with the most chilling of names, damnatio ad bestias. The Romans had a phrase for it, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The words sound clinical, almost bureaucratic, as if penned in the quiet of a magistrate's chamber. And in truth, that was the horror. This was not the whim of a vengeful emperor, nor a crime of passion. It was a system with scrolls and signatures, seals and clerks, a machinery of death that dressed itself in the language of law. Rome had discovered something chilling, that cruelty, when written in ink and stamped with a magistrate's authority, could pass as order. A man did not simply fall afoul of an emperor's mood. He was processed, scheduled, placed upon the roster of games as neatly as a gladiator or a wild animal. His crime became the prelude, his body the entertainment, his death the climax of a civic performance. And the crimes, they ranged from the terrible to the trivial. Treason, murder, arson, but also forgery, petty theft, desertion from the legions. Even something as private as worshipping a god not sanctioned by the state could draw the fatal sentence. The law, like the jaws of the lion, opened wide enough to swallow anything. In practice, it served one purpose, to keep the arena supplied. The simplicity of it was the most terrifying part. A wrong word, a false coin, a whispered prayer to the wrong deity, and one could find oneself paraded through the tunnel into the arena. This was not a private execution. There was no hiding of the condemned, no quiet dignity. Rome believed that death, to be effective, must be a public act. The amphitheater itself was structured to remind each spectator of their place in the order that had condemned the prisoner. The poorest citizens packed into the upper tiers, craning their necks for a glimpse. Senators and equestrians sat lower, their togas catching the sun. Vestal virgins had their reserved seats of honor, as though purity itself required the seasoning of blood. The emperor, in his gilded box, looked not just upon the condemned, but upon the whole city gathered as witnesses. The architecture turned the very act of watching into participation, and there was choreography beyond the killing itself. The schedule of the games unfolded with precision. Mornings reserved for hunts and displays of exotic beasts, midday for executions like damnatio ad bestias, afternoons for gladiatorial combats. To watch the condemned die at noon was not a gruesome accident. It was a ritual pivot. It cleansed the palate of the crowd with horror before offering them the skill and spectacle of the gladiators later. The condemned did not enter as themselves. They were stripped, costumed, transformed into something else before they stepped onto the sand. In this way, Rome made sure that when the beasts tore them apart, they died not as Marcus the deserter or Julia the forger, but as the embodiment of crime itself. This was pedagogy written in flesh. The crowd could look and say, "So dies treason, so dies impiety," and yet, beneath the cloak of law and ritual, there lay a more sinister truth. Rome had turned justice into a supply chain. Governors in the provinces, eager to curry favor, sent their prisoners to Rome as gifts, ensuring a steady stream of bodies for the games. The more condemned men and women one could provide, the more loyal one appeared to the imperial system. Trials became not so much about guilt or innocence, but about maintaining this flow. Consider the subtle cruelty of paperwork. Papyrus scrolls that named a man's crime, sealed with wax, sent along with him to the arena. Official documents legitimized the killing, but they also stripped it of intimacy. The judge could shrug. The executioner could wash his hands. The crowd could cheer. It was not murder, it was procedure. In this way, Rome invented something still recognizable to us. The bureaucracy of brutality. Death was not the byproduct of vengeance. It was a civic obligation, a scheduled performance with tickets, programs, and seats. The crowd did not merely witness punishment, they consumed it, and the state made certain that there was always enough to go around. When the gates opened at noon and the first condemned stumbled into the sun, they carried not only their crimes, but also the weight of an entire system. Their bodies were the script, their screams the chorus. What the crowd applauded was not the death of a single soul, but the triumph of order itself. Rome had proven again that it could transform even justice into theater, and the sand, red with blood, bore silent witness that law had become spectacle. Justice in Rome was never blind in the amphitheater, it was spectacular. Trials and decrees culminated not in dusty courts, but in the midday sun, where guilt was paraded and punishment made into a lesson for all. What the Romans called damnatio was less a judgment than a script, performed for a people trained to read pain as moral instruction. The rhythm of the day was essential. At dawn, the crowd thrilled to the hunts, the venations, as exotic animals from Africa or the East were loosed and killed by hunters. The sand was stained, the appetite whetted, but by midday, the atmosphere darkened. The condemned were led out in groups, sometimes chained, sometimes costumed, sometimes stripped bare. This was the interlude of executions, and the Roman crowd knew it well. It was the hour when justice paraded naked, when entertainment and terror fused. By late afternoon, after cruelty had reached its fever pitch, the gladiators would come, disciplined, trained, celebrated. The sequence mattered. Horror first, catharsis after. Each condemned person carried not just their fate, but a message. Their deaths were designed to be read like a text by the assembled thousands. Treason. Then the condemned might be burned alive, showing the cost of defying Rome's unity. Arson. Perhaps the condemned would be torched in mockery of their crime. Impiety. The beasts would do the work. The victim cast as a morsel for gods and men alike. There was nothing random. Every execution was a theater of symbols. But it was not only magistrates and emperors who shaped this theater. The crowd itself had a voice, a dangerous one. Libelli, petitions, and placards could be presented by citizens to the emperor or the editor of the games, demanding harsher sentences or pleading mercy. The roar of tens of thousands was itself a verdict. Sometimes an emperor would spare a man, not for justice but for effect. to demonstrate the breadth of his power by offering life as casually as he could take it away. At other times, the same roar that demanded blood became the executioner, pressuring magistrates to sacrifice another life to satisfy the multitude. And it is here we glimpse the most disturbing truth. The line between state and crowd was porous. The arena was not simply an imposition of terror from above. It was a contract, a cruel pact in which the people themselves demanded blood, and the state obliged them. The spectators did not merely absorb the lesson, they rehearsed their loyalty to Rome by cheering it. Even the seating was political. Senators in their marble steps watched with studied composure. Equestrians leaned forward in eager judgment. Plebeians shouted and jeered from the high tiers. Each class watched from its place, each life in the arena, a reminder of hierarchy. The condemned were the lowest rung, proof that citizenship and loyalty were fragile shields. Rome staged the executions not just for entertainment, but as a constant reassertion of order. Emperor, elites, plebs, slaves, and at the very bottom, those reduced to fodder for beasts. The psychology of this system is haunting. For the condemned, it was not only death that loomed, but degradation. To die in the privacy of a cell or on the honor of a battlefield was denied. Instead, they died in the open, made into lessons and mockeries, their last breath drowned in laughter or applause. Dignity itself was confiscated, parceled out to the crowd as entertainment. For the crowd, it was a heady mixture of fear and reassurance. Watching others suffer reminded them of their own vulnerability, but also affirmed their place as safe, as citizens, as members of the Roman body politic. Every torn body declared, "This is what happens to those who stand outside Rome's law." Every scream reinforced, "You are inside, you are safe." For now, and yet, beneath this surface, unease stirred. Ancient writers like Seneca, horrified by the midday shows, described the executions as degrading not just for the victims, but for the spectators themselves. He called it a corruption of the soul, a training in cruelty disguised as leisure. He saw what many must have felt but dared not admit, that every cheer chipped away at Rome's humanity, that the crowd itself was being condemned in spirit. But Rome endured by repetition, day after day, festival after festival, decade after decade. The cycle continued. The condemned entered, the crowd roared, the blood fell, the sand was raked smooth, and tomorrow the show would begin again. This was not justice hidden in shame. This was justice paraded in sunlight, made into a civic spectacle that reminded each Roman, with merciless clarity, who held the power to grant life, and who held the right to take it away. The Romans, restless masters of invention, soon discovered that the execution of criminals could be staged as something greater than mere punishment. Death, repeated in its simplicity, risked becoming monotonous, so they dressed it in costume, clothed it with the borrowed garments of myth. Thus, the condemned ceased to be themselves and became actors in a macabre drama, where the stories of gods and heroes were retold in flesh and blood. Imagine a man shackled with crude wings of wax and feathers, elevated upon a wooden platform before 80,000 eyes. The crowd does not see Marcus the deserter, they see Icarus, the dreamer who dared to fly, and when he is pushed, when the sun melts the wax and his body plummets to the sand, the story is fulfilled, the myth has come alive, but at the price of real human flesh breaking against the arena floor. Or take Dirce, the arrogant queen of Thebes, condemned in legend to be tied to the horns of a bull. In the Colosseum, this tale became grotesque reality. A condemned woman was stripped and bound to a beast that dragged her across the sand until her body shattered. The crowd did not cry out for her as an individual. They gasped at the sight of myth enacted before their eyes. Fiction had been seized, perverted, and baptized in blood. This was no accident of cruelty, it was deliberate dramaturgy. Roman organizers employed engineers and stage designers, men skilled in creating illusions of mountains, forests, even rivers inside the arena. Trapdoors sprang open to release animals as if from nowhere. Painted backdrops turned the sand into a theater where Olympus itself could be mocked and plundered. Costumes, masks, props, all were arranged to ensure that the condemned appeared not as humans but as characters. The logic was sinister. If the gods themselves had punished pride in legend, then Rome claimed the right to punish it in reality. By staging myths as executions, the empire arrogated to itself divine power. It proclaimed, "Not only do we rule the world of men, we rule the world of the gods. Your stories, your heroes, your sacred warnings, we can twist them, embody them, destroy them before your eyes." What did this do to the crowd? It trained them to see suffering as allegory. The condemned became less than human, they became lessons, enacted parables. The spectators applauded not just death, but the artistry of torment, the cleverness with which a myth was brought to life. Pleasure lay not only in blood but in the creativity of cruelty. It is tempting to call this depravity, to dismiss it as an ancient sickness. Yet the pattern is familiar. We too adapt myths into theaters of violence, cinema, games, literature where ancient legends are reborn, often with blood at their center. We consume them as fiction, forgetting that Rome consumed them as fact. The difference is only in medium. For the Romans, this fusion of story and slaughter was more than entertainment. It was propaganda of the most insidious kind. By executing a man as Icarus, or a woman as Dirce, the state sent a message. We can rewrite the stories of your culture. We can drag the sacred into the sand and make it our plaything. The emperor became not only ruler, but director, choreographer of myth itself. In this perversion, a dark brilliance shines. Rome did not only conquer lands and bodies, it conquered imagination. It hollowed out stories meant to warn or inspire, and filled them instead with shrieks and gore. The myth no longer taught humility or reverence, it taught obedience to Rome. And in this way, cruelty achieved something deeper. It became cultural control. The audience, dazzled by the spectacle, scarcely noticed that they were not only witnessing death, but also participating in the theft of their own legends. Every cheer was an act of consent. Every gasp of awe was a surrender of memory. The arena had become a temple where the gods themselves were sacrificed to Rome's power. Thus myth, born to elevate mankind, was dragged down into the dust of the amphitheater, where it became nothing more than another script in the endless theater of cruelty. And the people, enthralled, applauded. The fusion of myth and flesh had an effect deeper than the eye could measure. What once lived as sacred tale, whispered around fires or sung on stages, was now stripped of transcendence and made grotesquely tangible. For the Romans, the moment a condemned man was hurled from a platform as Icarus, or a woman was bound as Dirce, was not tragedy, it was amusement. And for the crowd, that was the true thrill. To see stories they had known since childhood, rewritten in screams. Greek tragedy, performed in the theater of Athens centuries earlier, was built on catharsis. Its violence, often hidden off stage, was meant to stir pity and fear, to cleanse the soul. Rome inverted this entirely. Here, the violence was not concealed but flaunted. There was no cleansing, only the sharpening of appetite. The boundary between myth and reality collapsed in a way that delighted the audience, for it meant that the world of gods and legends was no longer distant. It was right before them, dying in the dust. The more inventive the torment, the more delighted the crowd. They clapped not only for death but for creativity, the clever staging, the costumes, the sudden entrance of animals through trapdoors. The condemned were no longer condemned. They were props, flesh twisted into performance. The audience judged the artistry as much as the outcome. And this, perhaps, was the most unsettling aspect. Cruelty had become an aesthetic value. One might ask, why did the Romans, heirs to centuries of philosophy and engineering, descend into such theater? The answer lies in power. The myths, once belonging to poets and priests, were stolen and turned into instruments of the state. By reenacting the punishments of Icarus, Dirce, or Hercules in real blood, Rome claimed not only dominion over human life, but over narrative itself. The emperor became co-author of myth. The gods themselves, silent in their heavens, seemed to nod in submission. To the common citizen, the lesson was simple but unforgettable. If gods punished hubris, Rome punished it more vividly. If legends warned against defiance, Rome could enforce those warnings with beasts, fire, and chains. And the lesson was carried home, repeated in markets and taverns, passed down like folklore. Rome is greater than the gods. The enjoyment of these spectacles reveals something profound about the psychology of the crowd. To delight in such scenes required a suspension of empathy, a willingness to erase the humanity of the condemned. The audience trained itself, show after show, to see agony not as suffering but as symbolism. To applaud the artistry of torment was to practice indifference, to rehearse the silencing of conscience. Seneca himself railed against the noon spectacles, calling them poison for the soul, a training ground in cruelty masquerading as leisure. His words reveal that some Romans recognized the danger, not to the condemned, but to themselves, and yet the crowds came. They cheered, laughed, shouted. They bought tickets as though to a festival, dressed in their finest, and treated executions as family outings. The arena was more than entertainment. It was identity. To be Roman was to sit in those stands, to watch Rome display its dominion in blood and story alike. What had begun as punishment was now something larger, a collective ritual in which cruelty became culture, where mythology itself was consumed as bread and circuses. And this transformation, from moral tale to bloody spectacle, signaled a point of no return. If we dare compare across centuries, the echo is unsettling. Today, we too consume myths made violent, not in the amphitheater, but in films, series, and games where legends are reborn through combat and slaughter. We watch safely, aware of the illusion, yet the fascination is unchanged. The collision of story and death, of fiction and flesh. Rome had simply stripped away the illusion. There, the stories were not told. They were lived, with real blood, and the audience, enraptured, forgot the original purpose of myth. They no longer sought wisdom or warning. They sought spectacle. This was the perfect perversion of imagination. Myth, which should elevate, was dragged into the sand. And the people, who should have shuddered, applauded. Rome had succeeded in the most chilling conquest of all, not merely the domination of nations or bodies, but the conquest of meaning itself. If myth could be bent into cruelty, fire could be turned into theater. No one understood this more than Nero, the emperor who longed to be remembered not as a statesman but as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a musician, an actor upon the stage of history. Yet his most infamous art was not written in verse or melody. It was painted in human flame. The instrument of this spectacle was called the tunica molesta, the troublesome tunic. The process was brutally simple. A condemned prisoner, often Christians who refused to bend their knees to the cult of the emperor, was forced into a garment drenched in pitch or resin. Then, bound to a stake in the gardens or within the amphitheater, they were set alight. In a matter of moments, the body ceased to be a body. It became a torch. For Nero, this was not execution, it was decoration. Chroniclers tell of imperial banquets held in the twilight, the gardens illuminated by these human flames. Guests strolled among flowers while men and women screamed as they burned, their agony mingling with the laughter and music. Fire, sacred in so many cultures as a symbol of purity or divine presence, was here desecrated, turned into a spectacle of humiliation. Nero justified the practice with mythology. The burning bodies, he claimed, recalled the fate of Hercules, consumed by the poisoned tunic of Nessus. But there was no heroism here, no cleansing fire. It was not myth reborn. It was myth hollowed out, twisted into an excuse for sadism. The condemned did not die as Hercules. They died as props in Nero's theater of cruelty. What made this horror more chilling was its theatricality. The flames did not rise by accident. They were timed, choreographed, placed to light pathways and arcades. The condemned were positioned so that their suffering illuminated the emperor's stage. Fire became not a punishment but a spotlight, casting Nero himself as the star of the night. And the people, they came to watch. Chroniclers record not only nobles, but common citizens attending these spectacles, their faces bathed in the orange glow of burning flesh. Some came for novelty, some for loyalty, some because to turn away would mark them as suspect. The crowd was not innocent. They laughed. They applauded. They whispered rumors that the condemned deserved their fate. Terror and entertainment blurred until they were indistinguishable. Yet beneath the glow of those torches lay a darker truth. Rome had discovered that death could be made into light, that agony could be reframed as beauty. A man's last scream was drowned by the sound of clinking goblets. A woman's body became a lantern guiding guests through imperial gardens. Cruelty was not hidden, it was celebrated, aestheticized, normalized. This transformation reveals something profound about Nero's psychology. To him, the empire was a stage, its people mere actors, and himself the playwright. He did not simply rule, he directed. Where other emperors wielded armies, Nero wielded spectacles, arranging human suffering as if it was scenery in a play. In his mind, cruelty became a form of art. But in making art out of agony, Nero accomplished something that outlived him. He revealed how fragile the boundary is between justice, myth, and entertainment. With the stroke of imperial will, an execution became a performance, a torch became decor, a life became nothing more than a passing flame in the night. The smoke rose, the bodies crumbled to ash, and yet the memory burned longer than the flesh. For in those fiery nights, Rome crossed a threshold. Death was no longer merely inflicted, it was displayed, consumed, and repackaged as light. And once a civilization learns to burn human beings as lanterns for feasts, what limit remains? To call the burning bodies of Nero's victims torches was not only cruelty, it was language turned against itself. Chroniclers speak of them as corpora lucida, luminous bodies. The phrase chills the blood. Light, once the symbol of clarity, wisdom, even divinity, was here born of pitch, resin, and human screams. The empire had taken one of the most sacred images of humanity, the flame, and filled it with darkness. But the effect was not only visual, it was communicative. Each torch sent a message that reverberated across Rome. There is no sanctuary, no god, no conscience, no community could shield you from the empire's reach. To resist was not merely to risk death, it was to risk becoming a lamp for Nero's feast, a spectacle for strangers' laughter. The emperor had transformed execution into a language of terror. For the condemned, especially Christians who refused to worship the emperor as divine, their deaths carried a second meaning. As their bodies ignited, some cried out hymns instead of screams, turning agony into testimony. Chroniclers later recorded these voices as seeds of martyrdom. Where Nero meant to silence, he accidentally created memory. The fire did not erase belief, it branded it into history. Still, for most spectators, the effect was simpler. They laughed, they gawked, they allowed themselves to believe the condemned deserved their fate. To turn away, to weep, to refuse the entertainment would be dangerous, an implicit criticism of the emperor. So the crowd became complicit, forced by fear yet warmed by spectacle. A society that applauds flames soon forgets the difference between light and burning. This was Rome's genius and its curse. Cruelty was never isolated, never hidden in dungeons. It was public, polished, repeated. Spectacle was both weapon and shield. By multiplying these displays, emperors inoculated the population against pity. The more bodies burned, the less each mattered. And yet, beneath the horror, something profound shifted in culture. Death ceased to be a private, tragic end. It became an image, a performance designed not for the dignity of the dead, but for the emotions of the living. The condemned no longer existed for themselves. They existed as a scene to be remembered or forgotten by those who watched. In this transformation lies the most insidious lesson of Rome. When suffering becomes entertainment, humanity itself becomes expendable. This seed has endured across time. Modern eyes recoil at the thought of men and women turned into torches. Yet the mechanism lingers. When images of execution or catastrophe circulate today as political messages or viral shock, we see the same transformation, agony repackaged as spectacle. The medium has changed, but the hunger remains. Nero's torches, then, were more than the atrocities of a mad emperor. They were a rehearsal for something larger, the trivialization of pain, the rewriting of suffering into propaganda, the transformation of death into a stagecraft of power. Each luminous body was not only a victim but a reminder. In Rome, the state controlled not just how you lived or how you died, but what your death would mean. And so, as the flames flickered in the imperial gardens, reflected in goblets and jewels, Rome illuminated not the darkness of night, but the darkness within itself. If Nero turned human beings into torches, later emperors dreamed of something even grander, spectacle on a scale that rivaled the gods themselves. For an empire addicted to novelty, individual executions eventually lost their sting. The crowd, like any audience, craved escalation. And so the architects of terror asked, if one death thrills, what of 100? If a beast hunt excites, what of an entire war fought anew? Thus was born the Naumachia, the naval battle staged not on seas, but in the very heart of Rome. The Colosseum, that vast amphitheater of stone, was not only a stage for gladiators and beasts. Ingeniously, it could be flooded. Roman engineers, masters of aqueducts and hydraulics, designed intricate channels, sluices, and underground reservoirs. With the pull of a lever and the turning of bronze valves, millions of liters of water poured into the arena, transforming sand into a shimmering lake. Where lions had roared in the morning, triremes floated by afternoon. These were not toy ships or stage props. They were real war vessels, triremes and biremes, fully armed and crewed not by sailors, but by prisoners and the condemned, shackled to oars, handed real weapons. They became soldiers in a battle they could never win. Two fleets faced each other, sometimes costumed as historic enemies, Athenians against Syracusans, Carthaginians against Romans. History itself was forced to repeat, not in books but in blood. At the signal from the imperial podium, a trumpet blast, a downward gesture, the chaos began. Oars churned, rams splintered hulls, grappling hooks pulled ships close. Men screamed as they were cut down on decks or flung into the water. The crowd roared approval as the clean blue turned red, waves frothing with bodies and broken timbers. Unlike in the open sea, there was no escape. Walls enclosed the water, trapping the condemned in a lake of death. The sheer logistics are staggering. Timber was hauled from distant forests to build ships that would be destroyed in a single afternoon. Armories were emptied to arm men who would never return the swords. Thousands of prisoners were marched into the city, not for judgment, but for slaughter disguised as history. Even the sand itself was washed away by water, then drained through hidden sluices after the carnage ended, leaving the arena pristine by the next day. Engineering genius and cruelty had become indistinguishable. For the audience, the scale was intoxicating. It was no longer a duel or a beast tearing apart a single man. It was war. War contained, choreographed, sanitized of risk for those who watched. Citizens who had never seen a battlefield could now sip wine and applaud as if Jupiter himself had conjured oceans beneath their feet. In this, Rome revealed its deepest obsession, not only to dominate the present, but to reenact the past under its control. Battles that had once shaken empires were restaged as entertainment, their outcomes predetermined by the emperor's will. History itself became a puppet, its great moments replayed with living actors destined to drown or bleed for spectacle. The Naumachia was the ultimate marriage of technology and terror, a miracle of construction serving nothing but destruction. And in its reflection, we see the paradox of Rome, an empire of extraordinary builders who poured their brilliance into creating machines of death. The same hands that raised aqueducts to carry life-giving water also flooded the Colosseum to drown men in it. Every splash, every sinking ship, every cry for mercy swallowed by water was not only a spectacle but a statement. Rome could command not only armies, not only peoples, but nature itself. It could summon oceans where there was none. It could dictate history. It could make the impossible real. The Colosseum, shimmering like a lake under the afternoon sun, became a mirror of the empire itself. Beautiful, ingenious, and utterly ruthless. Of all the staged naval battles, one stands out in memory: the colossal Naumachia organized by Emperor Claudius on Lake Fucine. Unlike the Colosseum spectacles, this was no confined basin but a true lake, reshaped by Roman engineering into a watery stage. 19,000 men, prisoners of war, convicts. The condemned were forced into fleets, each dressed to represent legendary foes. The crowd, perched on hastily built stands around the shoreline, watched as history itself was rewritten with oars and blood. Before the first trumpet sounded, those men raised their voices in a line that would echo across centuries. Ave, Imperator. Moritur te salutant. Hail, Caesar. Those who are about to die salute you. It was not devotion. It was resignation, a chorus of human beings acknowledging their role in the machinery of Rome, where life could be reduced to one final gesture before the plunge into death. The emperor, seated in majesty, gave the signal. Chaos followed. Ships rammed and splintered. Boards crashed together. Swords rang across wet decks. Men drowned beneath the weight of their armor. Arms thrashing in water turned black with blood. Spears pierced the waves, striking not just flesh, but the desperate hands of those trying to climb aboard. In minutes, the lake was a battlefield, but one stripped of meaning. It was not conquest or defense. It was carnage curated for applause. The cruelty was sharpened by hope. Claudius, like other emperors, dangled the promise that the victors might be pardoned. A sliver of salvation was enough to make 19,000 men fight with a frenzy born of desperation. Each stroke of the oar, each slash of the blade carried the impossible dream that perhaps, if they killed enough of their fellows, they might live to see another dawn. Hope itself was the empire's weapon, a leash tighter than any chain. When the last ship sank and bodies floated lifeless beside shattered timbers, another miracle began. Roman engineers opened sluices, draining the lake of its crimson waters. Within hours, the stage was cleared, the corpses vanished, the blood diluted, the evidence of slaughter washed away. Tomorrow, the empire would eat, drink, and govern as if nothing had happened. Rome had perfected the art of erasure. Death left no trace but memory, and memory itself was reshaped by the official narrative. For the audience, the spectacle was intoxicating. They had not merely watched a man mauled by beasts. They had watched a war. They had witnessed entire fleets clash, history condensed into a single afternoon. From the emperor's box to the plebeian benches, all could marvel that Rome, with its aqueducts and armies, could summon the sea, command ships, and bend thousands of lives to its will. But beneath the grandeur lay a truth as chilling as the water itself. Rome had discovered that mass death was not just possible, but pleasurable to behold. When 19,000 men could be thrown into a lake for sport, what life had meaning, what boundary remained between justice and massacre. The naumachia was not simply entertainment. It was a declaration. Rome controlled not only land and people, but also the very rhythm of history and nature. Seas could be conjured, battles replayed, hope dangled, and death erased. And the people, enraptured, applauded. Yet even oceans of blood could not satisfy Rome forever. A strange law of cruelty governed the games. What shocked today became routine tomorrow. The crowd, numbed by repetition, began to crave novelty. It was not enough to see gladiators duel with skill, or beasts tear a single victim apart. They demanded the unexpected, the grotesque, the absurd. To hold the attention of tens of thousands, the organizers of spectacles had to reinvent death itself. Thus were born the abati, the blind duels. Two gladiators were sealed into helmets without eye-holes, armed with blades they could not direct. They stumbled across the sand, striking at shadows, colliding by accident. The crowd shrieked with laughter each time a man swung wildly or tumbled headlong into the dust. Skill no longer mattered. Death itself had become a farce, a lottery decided not by strength or courage, but by blind chance. And still it escalated. Dwarfs, called nani, were purchased, trained, and forced to fight one another. Worse still, they were sometimes pitted against women gladiators. Creating spectacles meant not to awe but to humiliate. It was not combat, it was parody. The audience laughed not at victory or defeat, but at the mockery of the fighters' very bodies. Other matches pushed the grotesque further. Gladiators were armed with spoons, wooden clubs, or comically oversized weapons, their chances of survival deliberately reduced to a joke. Sometimes condemned men were sent against animals they could never hope to defeat. Bears, elephants, even rhinoceroses, armed only with sticks or knives. These were not contests. They were slaughter arranged to look ridiculous. The arena, once a theater of courage and honor, degenerated into a circus of humiliation. The objective was no longer to display strength or skill, but to provoke laughter, revulsion, or shock. The blood was still real, the deaths irreversible, but their meaning had shifted. It was not tragedy, it was comedy, painted in gore. What drove this descent? At its heart, it was the weariness of a people drowned in violence. Rome had seen too many corpses, too many lions leaping, too many gladiators crossing swords. The appetite dulled, and to spark it again required perversion. The crowd, like addicts, demanded ever more bizarre doses of cruelty to feel anything at all. The social consequences were profound. A society that once honored the bravery of gladiators now jeered at dwarfs, blind fighters, and mutilated men. The line between soldier and clown, between death and entertainment, collapsed. When death becomes a joke, what dignity remains? Even the emperors recognized the shift. Editors of games competed to outdo one another, bankrupting themselves to stage spectacles strange enough to hold attention. Exotic animals were imported at vast expense, trained for bizarre tricks, or slaughtered in ways that mocked the natural order. Violence was no longer about demonstrating Rome's power. It was about keeping the crowd amused. And so, the arena revealed a new sickness. Not only in its cruelty, but in its absurdity. It was a culture so steeped in blood that it had grown immune to its own horror. Pain no longer shocked, death no longer awed, only ridicule, parody, and grotesque invention could stir the hearts of spectators who had seen too much. What had once been solemn demonstrations of power now decayed into spectacles of mockery. Rome's appetite for cruelty had not diminished. It had simply changed flavor. And in this shift lay the seed of something more dangerous than bloodlust. Moral anesthesia, a numbness that could laugh at agony as easily as it once trembled before it. The Colosseum was no longer a stage for dignity, but a mirror of Rome's own exhaustion. The more violence it consumed, the less it could feel. This was the true sickness of the late empire. Moral anesthesia. What had once been awe-inspiring now drew only yawns. The audience, dulled by the endless cycle of screams and blood, demanded ever stranger spectacles to break through their numbness. It was not enough to see men die bravely. They had to die ridiculously. Blind gladiators blundering in the dust, dwarfs clashing with women, condemned men armed with wooden spoons against roaring beasts. These were not contests, but jokes. The laughter of the crowd became as important as the gasps of horror had once been. Rome had discovered a new form of cruelty, humiliation. This shift revealed something about the crowd itself. Once, They had been trained to read pain as instruction, every death a warning, every scream a lesson in Rome's power. Now, the lesson was gone. The crowd no longer needed moral justification. They wanted sensation, pure and simple. They wanted to feel something, anything, in a world oversaturated with blood. And so the games became grotesque parodies, stripping away not just dignity from the condemned, but meaning from death itself. Economics played its part. Editors of games, desperate to win popularity, competed with ever more bizarre inventions. Exotic animals were purchased at ruinous cost, shipped from the farthest corners of the empire. Thousands of men were trained, armed, and slaughtered only to provoke laughter for an hour. The entire empire became a supply chain for cruelty, feeding a hunger that could never be sated. The crowd was not passive. They were accomplices. Their jeers shaped the spectacles. Their laughter rewarded the absurdities. Their petitions demanded more. Every cheer was an approval stamp. Every roar a signal to emperors and magistrates alike. This is what Rome craves, and so the machinery of humiliation spun on, not merely imposed from above, but powered from below. Writers of the time saw the danger. Juvenal, in his biting satires, warned of a populace reduced to panem et circenses, bread and circuses, content to trade liberty for entertainment. Seneca lamented that the midday executions turned citizens into butchers of the soul, teaching cruelty instead of virtue. They understood that Rome was not only punishing the condemned, it was corrupting itself. And indeed, the corruption spread. Gladiators who once fought with honor became tools of ridicule. The execution ground became a stage for parody. Dignity evaporated, and with it, the last traces of restraint. When laughter greets suffering, when parody replaces pity, what boundary remains? If we look closely, we might see the pattern repeating. Modern audiences, too, hunger for novelty, for ever more shocking spectacles. Television humiliates contestants for ratings. Viral videos mock the pain of strangers. The grotesque and absurd trend faster than the dignified. The Romans are not as distant from us as we like to believe. Their laughter in the face of agony is echoed in our own casual consumption of suffering, albeit sanitized on screens. In the end, this transformation marked a point of no return. Rome, once the master of disciplined armies and ordered law, had become a culture addicted to cruelty, numb to its own horrors, laughing at the very thing that should have terrified it. The Colosseum, roaring with mirth at blind gladiators stabbing the air, was not only a theater of death, it was a theater of decay. Into this theater of decay strode a figure whose very presence shattered every taboo. The Emperor Commodus, son of the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, heir to the largest empire on earth. Commodus should have embodied the dignity of Rome's highest office. Instead, he craved something baser. He wanted the roar of the crowd, not as emperor, but as entertainer. Commodus did not govern from the marble halls of the Palatine. He descended into the sand of the Colosseum, sword in hand, dressed as a gladiator. To the Romans, this was scandal. The emperor was the arbiter of life and death, the embodiment of Jupiter's power on earth. To see him sweating in armor among slaves and criminals was to see the world inverted. But Commodus did not care. He wanted ovations. He wanted the intoxication of applause. Yet his combats were farces. His opponents were carefully chosen, novice gladiators with wooden weapons, veterans ordered not to resist, cripples dragged into the arena with no chance at defense. Commodus struck them down one after another while the crowd roared on cue. The plebeians applauded not out of admiration but out of fear, for who would dare to boo the emperor? Senators, seated grimly in their rows, were forced to watch their ruler debase his office, powerless to object. He fancied himself Hercules reborn. Statues showed him with lion skin draped across his shoulders, club in hand, proclaiming his divine strength. In the arena, he hunted beasts, but never with courage. From elevated platforms, he shot arrows into ostriches, giraffes, even elephants, creatures brought at enormous cost from the farthest provinces of the empire. Dio Cassius records that in a single day, Commodus slaughtered hundreds of animals, turning the arena into a charnel ground of exotic life. But it was not enough to play hero. Commodus demanded to be paid for his appearances, an emperor charging the treasury of Rome itself for each spectacle he staged. 1,000,000 sesterces per performance, draining coffers already strained by war and plague. He turned the throne into a stage, and the empire into a paying audience for his vanity. What did this mean for Rome? It meant the highest office had been hollowed out. The emperor was no longer the guarantor of law or the commander of armies. He was the lead actor in a bloody farce, degrading both himself and the empire before the eyes of the people. Power had ceased to be governance. It had become spectacle. Psychologically, Commodus embodied a sickness already festering in Rome, the confusion of entertainment with legitimacy. He did not seek conquest or reform. He sought ovation. He craved the intoxication of applause more than the stability of his realm. By stepping into the arena, he erased the line between ruler and performer, between authority and parody, and the people, trapped between fear and fascination, played along. They cheered because they must. They laughed because they feared silence. They pretended admiration for a man who debased the empire's dignity. Rome itself had become complicit in its emperor's narcissism. Commodus, the crowned gladiator, was not only a symptom of Rome's decline, he was its emblem. When the emperor himself became a sideshow, the empire ceased to be a state. It became a circus. Commodus's obsession with spectacle did not stop at the mockery of gladiatorial duels. His favorite diversion was the venatio, the staged hunts where beasts from across the empire were slaughtered for the crowd's delight. But even here, the emperor could not resist reshaping the event into an exhibition of his own vanity. Unlike the hunters who faced lions or leopards on equal ground, Commodus never risked his life. He stood on raised platforms, armed with javelins and bows, striking down animals from a distance. Ostriches fell with their long necks severed by his arrows. Giraffes crumpled awkwardly in the dust. Elephants bellowed before collapsing under volleys of spears. Dio Cassius writes that he once killed 100 lions in a single day. But this was not courage. It was extermination. The animals were not chosen at random. They were exotic, symbolic, gathered from the farthest reaches of Rome's dominion. To slay them before the people was to demonstrate mastery not only over beasts, but over the lands they came from. Africa, Asia, the East. Each carcass on the sand was an emblem of empire, a reminder that Rome could summon the wonders of the world and destroy them for amusement. But the truth beneath the spectacle was grotesque. These creatures had been transported at staggering expense, captured, caged, dragged across deserts and seas, only to die in mock hunts. The empire bled its coffers for Commodus's vanity, draining provinces of wealth and life to keep the Colosseum stocked with wonders to kill. The crowd, too, was trapped in the performance. To cheer was mandatory. To remain silent was dangerous. Many applauded out of fear rather than admiration. They watched their emperor strut in Hercules' lion skin, declaring himself the conqueror of beasts, even as they recognized the cowardice of his staged victories. Yet the applause rolled on. Forced by the logic of survival, the Senate seethed in silence. To them, Commodus's theatrics were not only shameful but ruinous. The empire's dignity, once embodied in disciplined generals and stoic rulers, had been sold cheap for laughter and ovations. The treasury groaned under the weight of his games, the provinces exhausted by the endless demand for animals, slaves, and condemned men to feed the arena. Rome was bleeding from within, and Commodus was the knife, and still he believed himself adored. Each roar from the stands, whether born of fear or compulsion, fed his delusion. He mistook forced applause for genuine love, spectacle for stability. In Commodus, the disease of Rome had reached its pinnacle, an emperor who sought not to rule, but to perform. The venatio was no longer about the thrill of man versus beast. It had become a portrait of the empire itself, wasteful, vain, feeding on its own spoils until nothing remained. The giraffes and ostriches were not the only casualties. Rome itself was being bled for applause. But every performance ends, and for Commodus, the curtain fell not in the Colosseum, but in the shadows of his palace. The man who strutted as Hercules reborn, who forced senators and plebeians alike to applaud his staged victories, could not choreograph his own end. His death came not as spectacle but as conspiracy. By the final years of his reign, Rome groaned under his excesses. The treasury was drained, the Senate humiliated, the people weary of endless games. Even those closest to him began to see his narcissism as a threat to the empire's survival. The turning point was not some great battle or rebellion, but the quiet disillusion of those within his circle, the very people who arranged his spectacles, who fed his ego, who once benefited from his favor. The plot was simple. First, poison slipped into a cup by his concubine. Marcia, who had once been his confidant, but now feared his madness. Commodus drank, but his body, hardened by excess, resisted, weakened but not destroyed. He staggered, still clinging to life. Then came the final act. Narcissus, his wrestling trainer, a man who knew every strength and weakness of his body. Under orders, he entered the chamber. As Commodus bathed, Narcissus wrapped a cord around his neck and strangled him. So ended the gladiator emperor, not beneath the roar of 80,000 voices, but in the silence of a bath. No applause, no spectacle, only the splash of water, the tightening of a rope, and the betrayal of those he trusted. The contrast is almost unbearable. The man who had demanded ovations for every staged kill, who had turned his throne into a circus, died unseen, unheard, as powerless as the crippled gladiators he once slaughtered. His body, once draped in lion skins, was left a husk, stripped of myth and pretense. The Senate, though relieved, recorded his death with bitterness. Chroniclers described it not as the passing of an emperor, but the end of a jester. He had reduced the purple robe of Rome to a costume, the scepter of power to a stage prop, and in the end, the farce devoured him. His death was not only the fall of a man, it was the collapse of an illusion. Rome had gambled that spectacle could replace governance, that applause could sustain empire, but Commodus proved the opposite. When rulers perform instead of rule, when power becomes theater, the empire rots from within. The gladiator who wanted to be adored as a god was remembered as a fool. His strangling was not just an assassination, it was the empire itself, snapping the cord around the neck of its own corruption. The strangling of Commodus was more than the end of a reign. It was the unmasking of an empire that had mistaken cruelty for strength, and spectacle for stability. For years, Rome had sustained itself on a diet of blood and applause, convincing itself that the arena could substitute for justice, that laughter could replace law, that bread and circuses were enough to bind a people together. Commodus's fall revealed the bankruptcy of that illusion. In the silence after his death, one truth emerged. The Colosseum could not save Rome. It had dazzled the people. It had terrified enemies. It had entertained emperors. But it had also hollowed out the empire's soul. Each scream had been a lesson not in power, but in corruption. Each spectacle had trained citizens not in virtue, but in complicity. Each corpse left behind a people more numb, more dependent on cruelty for meaning. The irony is cruel. The very tool meant to project Rome's immortality became the symbol of its decay. The arena that had once united the masses revealed, in the end, how divided the empire had become, between rulers who staged blood for ovation, and citizens who mistook amusement for freedom. Even in death, Commodus embodied this collapse. His strangling was not noble, not tragic, not mythic. It was sordid, pathetic, fitting for a man who had degraded the purple into costume. Chroniclers linger on the irony. The emperor who dreamed of dying to the applause of thousands instead perished unseen, gasping for air in his own bath. The crowd he so craved did not cheer his end. They learned of it only after the deed was done. Yet his fate was not merely personal. It was symptomatic. Rome itself had become addicted to spectacle, and like all addictions, it consumed its host. Violence had once been an instrument of control. Now it was entertainment, a narcotic that dulled the empire's sense of purpose. The Colosseum, filled with jeers and laughter, was not the heart of Rome's vitality. It was the theater of its disease. The stones of that arena still stand. Tourists walk its corridors, gaze at its arches, marvel at its architecture. But beneath the grandeur lies memory, soaked into the sand. The echo of screams, the smell of blood, the applause of a crowd complicit in its own corruption. It is not a monument to Rome's glory, but to its fragility. The lesson endures. Any society that makes cruelty a habit, that transforms suffering into entertainment, that mistakes spectacle for stability, courts the same fate. Rome believed itself eternal, yet the empire fell, and the Colosseum remains, not as proof of immortality, but as a warning. The Colosseum, now a ruin bathed in golden light, whispers a story far darker than the grandeur its arches suggest. Tourists marvel at its scale, the precision of its stonework, the genius of Roman engineering. Guides speak of emperors and gladiators, of lions and swords, of the roar of 80,000 voices. Yet the true heart of this monument is not victory. It is addiction, an addiction to cruelty disguised as entertainment. Every grain of sand once drank blood. Every wall once shook with the applause of people who had learned to laugh at agony. Rome's citizens were not prisoners at these games. They were participants. Their cheers legitimized the violence. Their laughter ensured its repetition. The empire's cruelty thrived because the crowd demanded it. The Colosseum did not merely reflect Rome's power, it reflected its people's complicity. This complicity is perhaps the darkest legacy of all, for the arena was not built to punish only the condemned. It was built to teach the living. It trained the masses to see pain as pleasure, to accept brutality as normal, to surrender moral judgment in exchange for spectacle. Each execution, each humiliation, was propaganda written in flesh. Rome is invincible. Rome decides the meaning of your life and your death. And yet, what became of that invincibility? The empire crumbled, not with a single blow, but through slow decay. Corruption spread in its palaces. Division festered in its provinces. Enemies pressed at its borders. Bread and circuses could distract. But they could not save. The Colosseum outlived the empire itself. Its arches still standing even as the civilization that built it collapsed into dust. Today, we stand before those ruins and tell ourselves we are different. We no longer gather to watch men torn apart by beasts, or to see criminals burned alive for entertainment. But the mirror remains. Violence, repackaged and sanitized, is still consumed eagerly, in films that glorify blood, in viral images of suffering, in the voyeurism of catastrophe broadcast worldwide. We applaud not in stone arenas, but behind screens. The appetite has not vanished, it has only changed costume. The Colosseum warns us, if we choose to hear it, that cruelty, once normalized, corrodes the soul of a society. That spectacle, once enthroned as the heart of culture, hollows out law, justice, and morality. Rome conquered half the world, yet lost itself when it turned death into amusement. When we gaze at those arches, we should not see only the triumph of Roman engineering. We should see the fragility of civilization itself. The stones of the Colosseum are not monuments to Rome's greatness. They are gravestones marking the death of its soul. And as we listen to the silence where once 80,000 voices roared, we must ask the question the ruins still demand. When we look into the mirror of Rome, do we see only the past? Or do we also see ourselves? The journey into the Colosseum's shadow does not end with Rome's fall. Its arches still rise, weathered yet defiant, as though stone itself remembers. Travelers of every age have stood beneath them, pilgrims, conquerors, poets, and tourists alike, each hearing echoes of different ghosts. To medieval Christians, it was the site of martyrdom, where faith was tested by fire and fang. To Renaissance thinkers, it was a ruin both terrible and magnificent, proof that even giants fall. To modern visitors, it is a postcard of antiquity, stripped of screams, its bloodstains washed away by centuries. And yet, the essence of the arena lingers. Walk its corridors at dusk, when the crowds thin and the sun sets red through broken arches, and it feels less like a monument than a wound. You can almost hear the murmurs of tens of thousands, the trumpets sounding, the gates creaking open to release beasts or men. You can almost feel the trembling of those led across the sand, knowing their bodies were about to become instruments of entertainment. The Colosseum is a paradox. It is celebrated as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements, yet its purpose was destruction. It stands as a wonder of engineering, yet every brick was laid to hold more suffering. It is beautiful because it is terrible, terrible because it is beautiful. This paradox is why it survives not just in stone, but in memory. For the Colosseum is more than Rome's ruin. It is a mirror held up to every age that gazes into it. In its arches we see the danger of forgetting that cruelty, once normalized, corroded civilization. In its silence we hear the warning that applause for violence, however disguised, always demands a price. Rome believed itself eternal. Its armies conquered continents. Its laws shaped nations. Its roads stitched together the ancient world. And yet, what endures most vividly is not its victories, but its arena. The Colosseum remains because it is not just Rome's story, it is ours. Every time we consume suffering as entertainment, every time we mistake spectacle for truth, we walk its corridors again. The empire fell, but the appetite it revealed has not. That is why the Colosseum still speaks, not to tell us of Rome's glory, but to whisper of humanity's weakness, the hunger for blood, the seduction of spectacle, the danger of forgetting that behind every roar of the crowd lies the silence of the victim. And so, as the sun sets on the Colosseum, as shadows lengthen across its broken tiers, we are left with the most unsettling realization. Rome is gone, but the Colosseum endures, and in its endurance, it does not ask us to admire, it asks us to choose. Here, then, the journey closes, not with the roar of the crowd, but with silence. The silence of ruins, of arches that no longer frame triumphs but frame the sky, of corridors walked not by condemned men but by tourists with cameras. And yet beneath that silence, the Colosseum still breathes. Its stones carry memory, its sand, though long swept away, still bears the weight of countless bodies. The story of damnatio ad bestias, of gladiators, of emperors who turned cruelty into theater, is not only history, it is warning. For Rome did not collapse because of a single barbarian horde or a single corrupt ruler. It collapsed because spectacle replaced substance, because cruelty became culture, because the people forgot that applause cannot hold up a civilization. What remains most disturbing is not the blood spilled, but the laughter that accompanied it. That laughter echoes across centuries. It tells us that people can become accustomed to anything, even horror, if it is presented as entertainment. It tells us that cruelty, repeated often enough, ceases to feel cruel at all. The Colosseum, in the end, is not a monument to Rome's power. It is a gravestone marking the death of its soul. Each arch is a reminder of the bargain Rome struck, to trade humanity for spectacle, justice for performance, dignity for applause. A bargain that brought short-lived wonder, but long-lasting ruin. And now, as we look into its hollowed shell, the question is no longer about Rome. The question is about us. Have we changed? Or have we merely found new arenas, digital, virtual, global, in which to play out the same obsessions? We may not throw men to lions, but do we not consume their suffering through screens? We may not flood arenas with blood, but do we not flood our culture with images of pain disguised as entertainment? The Colosseum is a mirror, and when we look into it, the reflection we see is not only ancient Rome, it is humanity itself. The same hunger for spectacle, the same seduction of cruelty, the same danger of forgetting the line between justice and sadism. Rome is gone, but the Colosseum remains, not to glorify the empire, but to warn every age that follows. Its stones whisper, "Beware! The spectacle devours all, even those who applaud it."